I saw what they were planning. I discovered my son-in-law loosening part of my wife's wheelchair locking assembly while my daughter stood beside him, holding a napkin up to hide what he was doing. I didn't confront them. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stepped back into the shadows and watched. Hours later, that same man would lean against a chair while giving his engagement toast. The chair would give way beneath him, and 200 guests would watch in stunned silence. But before I tell you how I turned their plan around, there's something you should know before we get into it. Tell me where you're watching from. I genuinely love knowing how far these stories travel, especially when so many of us grew up believing family was supposed to mean something. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 66 years old, and I spent 38 years as a master electrician. That kind of work teaches you to notice things other people overlook. A loose connection, a damaged part, something that looks perfectly normal until the moment someone depends on it. That Friday evening, I arrived at the Whitmore Hotel early because my daughter, Renee, had asked me to check the microphones before her engagement party began. I expected to spend 20 minutes making sure everything worked and then find my wife. Nothing more. After all, this was supposed to be a happy night. Renee was getting married in 6 weeks. And after everything my wife, Diane, had endured, I wanted her to enjoy every minute of it. 11 months earlier, Diane had fallen down the back steps of our house. The accident damaged her spine and left her partially paralyzed in both legs. She could stand for short periods with a walker, but for longer distances, she depended on her wheelchair. That chair had become a complicated thing in our house. Diane needed it, but she hated needing it. For 30 years, she'd owned a flower shop and worked on her feet from morning until closing. She was the woman who carried boxes herself rather than asking somebody else to do it. Now, she sometimes worried that people saw the chair before they saw her. For the engagement party, we'd arranged a newer custom chair for her. She was actually excited about it. I remember her smiling when she told me, "At least this one doesn't make me feel like I'm sitting in a hospital." I told her she looked beautiful. She rolled her eyes and said, "You'd better say that when I'm wearing the dress." That was the Diane I knew. Strong, proud, still herself, which is why what I saw next nearly stopped me cold. I had just entered the ballroom when I heard voices near the head table. They were low, careful. I moved toward them without making a sound. Then I saw Preston. My future son-in-law was crouched beside Diane's wheelchair. There was a small screwdriver in his hand, and Renee was standing beside him, holding a folded napkin at exactly the right angle to keep anyone passing by from seeing what he was doing. For a second, I wondered if I had misunderstood. Then I looked closer. Preston wasn't fixing the chair. He was deliberately tampering with the locking assembly, the mechanism designed to keep the rear wheel secure when Diane needed to stop, transfer, or brace herself. He was altering it so the lock could appear normal while no longer being dependable under pressure. My stomach tightened. Then Renee leaned toward him. "Just make sure it happens during the toast," she whispered. She glanced toward the empty tables. "I want everyone watching." I stared at my daughter, my little girl, the same child I'd taught to ride a bicycle, the same woman I'd spent years protecting. And now she was helping her fiancé put her mother's safety at risk for the sake of a public spectacle. I could have walked over. I could have grabbed Preston by the collar and demanded an explanation, but something stopped me. Anger would get me one thing. Denials, they'd say I misunderstood. They'd say Preston was repairing the chair. They'd say Renee had been trying to help. And if I gave them the chance, they'd destroy whatever evidence existed before anyone else could see it. So I stepped back. I let them believe I was still unaware. And as I watched Preston put his screwdriver away, one question kept pounding through my head. Why? Why would my daughter help the man she loved endanger her own mother? This wasn't just cruelty. There had to be a reason, and I intended to find it. I walked away toward the sound equipment with a calm face, even though my heart was hammering. They thought their secret was safe. They had no idea I'd just seen the first piece of a much larger plan. I came to that hotel to test a microphone and celebrate my daughter's future. Instead, I discovered that the people standing closest to my family were preparing something against my wife. And before the night ended, I would find out that the wheelchair was only the beginning. I needed proof, not revenge. I walked away from the head table and forced myself to act normal. That was harder than it sounds. Every part of me wanted to turn around, grab Preston by the collar, and demand an explanation from my daughter. But anger wasn't going to help Diane. If I confronted them without knowing the whole story, they could deny everything. Renee could cry. Preston could put on that concerned fiancé act he perfected over the past 2 years. And somehow, by the end of the night, I could become the angry father who had ruined his daughter's engagement party. I wasn't going to hand them that advantage. So I went back toward the small sound booth near the side of the ballroom. Earlier that afternoon, I'd spent nearly half an hour with the hotel's AV technician checking the microphones and presentation system. That's why I knew there was a security monitor in the same service area. I found the technician still there. "Can you pull up the ballroom cameras for me?" I asked. He looked surprised. "Everything okay?" "I just want to check something near the head table." He brought up the feeds. Camera 3 covered the area I needed, and there they were. Preston crouched beside Diane's wheelchair, Renee standing guard, the screwdriver, the napkin. I didn't ask the technician to give me a copy. Instead, I asked him to rewind it. Then I pulled out my phone and photographed the monitor while the footage played. Not perfect evidence, but enough to prove I hadn't imagined what I'd seen. I also asked him to make a note of the time and camera number. That mattered. If I needed the hotel footage later, there would be a record of exactly when and where it existed. The technician glanced at me. "Is there a problem?" I looked at the screen. There might be. I didn't tell him anything else, because I still didn't know the most important part. Why would they do this? The footage showed me what Preston had done. It didn't tell me why, and that distinction mattered. I could expose them right then. But if I did, I might never learn what they were trying to accomplish. So I walked back into the ballroom. Renee spotted me almost immediately. "Dad." She smiled, but her eyes didn't. "Everything okay?" "Fine," I said. She studied me, a little too carefully. "You've been gone a while," checking the equipment. Her eyes flicked toward the service hallway, then back to me. "Did you see Mom's chair?" There it was. Not "How's Mom?" Not "Is everything working?" The chair. I gave her a small smile. "It's fine." She held my gaze for another second. Then she smiled again. "Good." She walked away. I watched her join Preston. He leaned toward her and whispered something. Renee looked back at me. That was when I knew they were wondering whether I'd seen them. I decided to make their uncertainty work for me. A few minutes later, Diane arrived. She was wearing the blue dress she'd bought for the party. I helped her settle into the wheelchair and quietly checked the locking assembly. It felt secure. Good. I didn't tell her what I'd discovered. Not yet. Diane looked at me. "You're quiet." "Just thinking." "About Renee?" I smiled. "You always know." "After 40 years, Walter, I should hope so." I squeezed her hand. Then Preston came over. "Everything comfortable?" he asked. Diane nodded. "Perfectly." "Good," he said. "We want a night to be special." I looked at him. "I'm sure you do." For just a moment, his smile tightened. Then he walked away. I followed him with my eyes. That's when I noticed something I'd missed earlier. Every time Preston passed a small platform where he'd eventually give his toast, he glanced toward the same folding chair position beside it. He didn't sit in it. He didn't need to. He simply checked it. Once. Then again. And a third time. I looked at the chair. Then at Preston. Something about that bothered me. So I quietly asked the event coordinator why that particular chair was there. She told me it had been placed exactly where Preston's family had requested it. "For his toast," she said. I nodded. "Did Preston request that himself?" She smiled. "Several times." That was interesting, because Preston wasn't just planning a speech. He had planned where he would stand, where he would reach, where he would brace himself. And suddenly, I realized the question wasn't whether Preston had a plan. He clearly did. The question was whether I could understand that plan without becoming part of it. I wasn't going to touch that chair. I wasn't going to hurt him. I wasn't going to create some dangerous stunt and pretend it was justice. But I was going to watch. Because if Preston had built tonight around a specific sequence of events, There was a good chance he'd eventually reveal the rest of it himself. And when he did, I wanted to be standing right there. I had proof that Preston and Renee were targeting Diane, but I still didn't know why. Then I discovered Preston had been obsessing over one particular chair all evening, and for the first time, I began to wonder whether his own plan contained the key to exposing him. I realized the chair was part of their plan. By the time dinner was served, I had stopped thinking about the party as a celebration. I was watching, not just Preston, everything around him. Renee kept smiling for photographs, but whenever Preston came near her, she lowered her voice. Diane noticed none of it. She was talking with an old friend from the flower shop, laughing about something that had happened years ago. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to wheel her out of that ballroom and take her home, but I still didn't know what Preston and Renee were trying to accomplish. And that mattered, because the footage I'd seen proved they were willing to endanger Diane. It didn't explain why. Then I saw Preston speaking with Chase near the bar. Chase was one of Preston's cousins, a younger man who had already had a couple too many drinks. I wasn't trying to listen, but when you hear your wife's name spoken in a quiet voice across a crowded room, you pay attention. Preston said something about the toast. Chase frowned. Then Preston leaned closer and said, "It's going to look like an accident. That's the whole point." Chase looked toward Diane. "You sure?" Preston nodded. "Nobody's going to blame me for helping." Then he walked away. Chase stayed behind. He looked at Diane for several seconds. And for the first time that night, I wondered whether he was involved or whether he'd simply realized too late what Preston was planning. I didn't approach him. Not yet. Instead, I followed Preston with my eyes. He walked toward the small platform where the speeches would take place. Then he stopped beside the folding chair I'd noticed earlier. He touched the back of it, not casually. He checked it. Then he looked toward the head table, toward Diane. That was when I knew the chair wasn't there by accident. I walked over to the event coordinator. "Excuse me, who placed that chair beside the platform?" She glanced at it. "I think one of the staff members did." "Did anyone ask them to?" She thought for a moment. "Preston did, I believe. He wanted it left there for the toast." "Why?" He said he liked having something nearby to steady himself when he stepped up to the microphone. I looked at her. "Does he normally need something to steady himself?" She laughed. "No, not that I've ever seen." Neither had I. I'd watched Preston give speeches before. He was confident, almost too confident. So why did he suddenly need a chair? I walked away without touching it. Then I watched the room. Preston was speaking to Renee again. He pointed toward the platform. She glanced at Diane, then back at him, and something clicked. The wheelchair, the chair, the toast, they weren't separate pieces. They were part of the same sequence. I didn't know every detail yet, but I could see the shape of it. They wanted Diane's chair to become the center of an apparent accident, and Preston wanted that folding chair position exactly where he could step in, appear to help, and control what everyone saw next. That explained the confidence. He wasn't improvising. He'd rehearsed it. I went back to Diane. She looked up at me. "You've been awfully quiet tonight." "I know. Something wrong." I looked at her hands resting on the armrests of her wheelchair. Then I looked into her eyes. "I just want you to stay close to me tonight." She smiled. "Walter, I'm not going anywhere." I nearly told her, but then Renee came over. "Mom, they're about to start the speeches." Diane smiled proudly. "You're big, Knight." Renee hugged her. For a second, her face was buried against her mother's shoulder, and when she pulled away, I saw something I hadn't expected. Her eyes were wet. She quickly wiped them. Then she looked at me. There was fear in her expression. I couldn't tell whether she was afraid of what was about to happen to her mother or afraid of what would happen to her if she refused to go through with it. That question stayed with me, because if Renee was being manipulated, there might still be a way to save my daughter from whatever she'd gotten herself into. But if she was willingly doing this, then I had a much bigger problem. The coordinator announced that the first toast would begin in a few minutes. Guests started turning toward the platform. Preston adjusted his jacket. Then he walked over to the folding chair one last time. He checked it and smiled. I didn't touch the chair. I didn't change anything. I simply stood beside my wife and watched, because whatever Preston had planned, he was about to carry out himself. And this time, I intended to let him. I finally understood that the wheelchair and the folding chair were connected, but I still hadn't discovered the most important part: what Preston planned to do once the accident happened. And I was about to watch him reveal it in front of 200 people. I let the trap begin. The first toast was supposed to be the easiest part of the evening. Instead, it became the moment I realized just how carefully Preston had planned everything. The lights softened. Conversations quieted. Guests turned toward the platform as Preston's father raised his glass. I stayed beside Diane, one hand resting lightly against the back of her wheelchair. She looked up at me. "You're awfully quiet tonight." "Just tired." She smiled. "You've never been good at hiding things from me." I almost told her, but then Renee stepped onto the platform. She thanked everyone for coming and talked about how excited she was to begin this new chapter of her life. Then she looked toward Diane. "Mom, you've always taught me that family comes first." Diane smiled through tears. I felt a knot form in my stomach. Renee stepped down. Then Preston stood. The applause started immediately. He straightened his jacket and walked toward the platform. As he passed Diane, he glanced at her wheelchair. Then he looked at me. I gave him nothing. He reached the microphone. The folding chair he'd specifically requested was still beside him. He placed one hand on its back. "First, I want to thank Walter and Diane." People applauded. Preston smiled. "You welcomed me into this family, and I don't take that lightly." His voice was smooth, confident, almost convincing. Then he looked toward Renee. She gave him a tiny nod. Preston raised his glass. "To family." The guest repeated it. Then he stepped away from the microphone and walked toward Diane. My entire body went rigid. He stopped beside her wheelchair. "Diane," he said warmly, "I wanted to thank you personally." She smiled. "You're welcome, Preston." He reached toward the back of the chair. I watched his fingers. He expected something to happen. Nothing did. The locking assembly held. Diane remained perfectly steady. For the briefest moment, Preston's expression betrayed him. Confusion, then anger. It disappeared almost immediately. He smiled again. "Well, that's good." He stepped away. The guests saw nothing unusual. But I did. His plan had failed, and he knew it. Preston returned to the platform. He reached for the folding chair. This time he didn't sit. He simply rested one hand on the back and continued his speech. "Marriage isn't just about two people," he said. "It's about trust." I almost laughed. Trust. That word sounded different coming from him. Then something caught my attention. Renee was standing beside the AV table. She was watching Preston. He looked toward her. She reached down and picked up something small, a black presentation remote. Then she walked toward him. As she passed behind the platform, she slipped it into his hand. Nobody noticed. Nobody except me. Preston closed his fingers around it. Then he looked toward the giant screen behind him. My stomach tightened. The screen, the slideshow, the toast, Diane's wheelchair. The pieces were beginning to fit together. But I still didn't know what Preston intended to trigger, or what he wanted the guests to see when it happened. Renee returned to her place beside the head table. I caught her eye. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I saw something in her expression. Not confidence, not excitement, fear. Her lips moved silently. 3 words. "Dad, I'm sorry." Before I could respond, Preston clicked the remote. The first photograph appeared on the screen. A picture of Renee as a little girl. The guests laughed warmly. Then another photograph appeared. Then another. Everything looked normal. But Preston wasn't watching the pictures. He was watching the timing. Waiting. And I suddenly understood something terrifying. Whatever was supposed to happen next wasn't an accident at all. It had been scheduled. And the person holding the remote knew exactly when to make it happen. Renee had just handed Preston the one thing that had controlled the room's attention without anyone realizing it. I still didn't know what he intended to trigger, but when the next image appeared on that screen, I finally saw the real target of their plan, what they really wanted. The first photograph appeared on the screen. Renee as a little girl, standing between Diane and me. The guest smiled. Someone laughed warmly. Then another photograph appeared. Renee at her high school graduation, then college, then her first apartment. For a few moments, the room felt exactly like an engagement party should. People were remembering the little girl Renee had been. But Preston wasn't looking at the photographs. He was watching Diane. Then he clicked the remote. The next image appeared. It was Diane sitting in her wheelchair. My stomach tightened. I knew that photograph. It had been taken outside our house after one of her physical therapy appointments. I hadn't given it to Preston. Neither had Diane. Another photograph appeared. Diane using her walker. Then another. Diane sitting at the kitchen table while I helped her sort through some paperwork. Then one of our house. Then another. The mood in the ballroom changed. People weren't smiling anymore. They were watching. Preston stepped toward the microphone. After Diane's accident, he said, "A lot of things changed for this family." Diane looked at me. "Walter?" I squeezed her hand. "I'm right here." Preston continued. "And sometimes, when someone we love becomes vulnerable, we have to start thinking about their future." That word caught my attention. Vulnerable. He wasn't talking about love anymore. He was building an argument. Another photograph appeared. This one showed Diane struggling to get out of the car. The room became painfully quiet. Then Preston displayed a county property record, not the original deed from our house. A publicly available property record. Something anyone willing to search the county records could obtain. I knew exactly what it was. Our house. Our names. The value of the property. Diane's face went pale. "What is he doing?" she whispered. I didn't answer, because I finally understood the direction this was going. Preston wasn't trying to steal our house tonight. He was trying to make people believe Diane could no longer manage her own life. The wheelchair, the photographs, the questions about our finances, the interest in our property. They were all pieces of the same story. A story in which Diane wasn't an independent woman recovering from an accident. She was someone who supposedly couldn't make important decisions without somebody else. And if that story became convincing enough, the next step would be much easier. Someone could start pushing for control over her financial decisions. Someone could argue that she needed another person managing her affairs. Someone like Preston. I looked at Renee. She was crying silently. And suddenly, I remembered something she'd said 3 months earlier. "Dad, maybe Mom shouldn't be handling all the paperwork anymore." I'd thought she was worried about Diane. Now, I wondered whether she'd already been listening to Preston. Preston clicked the remote again. A slide appeared with one sentence. "Who will protect Diane when Walter can't?" My jaw tightened. There it was. The real question. They weren't just attacking Diane. They were building a future in which I wasn't around to protect her. Preston looked directly at me. "I don't mean any disrespect," he said, "but families have to prepare for difficult possibilities." I stood slowly. The room went quiet. Preston's confidence faltered. I reached inside my jacket and pulled out the folded paper containing the camera number and timestamp from earlier that evening. I didn't need to say anything yet. I just wanted him to see it. His eyes dropped to the paper. His face changed. For the first time that night, Preston looked genuinely frightened. Renee saw it. Then she looked at me. "Dad." Her voice broke. I took one step toward her. "Renee, tell me the truth." She opened her mouth. The lights suddenly flickered. Once, twice. Then everything went black. The ballroom erupted. Chairs scraped across the floor. Someone screamed. A glass shattered. Diane grabbed my arm. "Walter, I'm here." I immediately looked toward the AV equipment. The emergency lights should have come on. They didn't. That told me this wasn't an ordinary power failure. 38 years as an electrician had taught me the difference between a blackout and something being deliberately interrupted. Somewhere near the equipment area, I heard the faint click of a switch. Then Preston's voice came through the darkness. "Now nobody can stop this." I turned toward the sound. And for the first time that night, I knew exactly where I needed to go. Preston thought darkness would hide what came next. He was wrong. I knew the electrical system in that room well enough to understand what had just happened, and I was about to discover why Preston needed the entire ballroom blind for the next part of his plan. The blackout was part of the plan. The ballroom was almost completely dark. For several seconds, nobody knew what had happened. Chairs scraped across the floor. Someone knocked over a glass. A woman near the back asked if there was a fire. Diane's fingers tightened around my arm. "Walter? I'm here." I could barely see her face, but I could hear the panic spreading through the room. Then I heard something that didn't belong. A faint electrical hum came from the AV equipment. I turned toward it. The hotel's emergency lighting should have come on immediately. It hadn't. That bothered me. I'd spent most of my adult life working with electrical systems, and I knew the difference between a circuit tripping and a system being deliberately interrupted. I moved toward the service area. The AV technician was already there. "What happened?" "I don't know," he said. "Everything just went down." I looked at the electrical panel. One of the auxiliary switches was in the OFF position, not tripped, off. Someone had moved it. I looked at the technician. "Did you?" He shook his head. "No." "Who has access back here?" "Staff. AV management." He hesitated. "And anyone working the event who was given access." That was enough. I didn't need to guess who had been moving around behind the scenes. I returned to the ballroom. The emergency lights were finally glowing faintly, and there stood Preston, still holding the presentation remote. He looked completely calm. Too calm. I looked at Renee. She wasn't. Her face was pale. "Dad, what is he doing?" She shook her head. "I didn't know he'd do this." "Do what?" She looked at Preston, then back at me. I thought it was only supposed to be paperwork. My stomach tightened. Before I could ask what she meant, Preston raised a remote. The screen suddenly came back on. A document appeared. It had Diane's name at the top. Underneath were descriptions of her mobility limitations, the assistance she required, and statements about her dependence on Walter for certain daily and financial matters. Diane stared at it. "I never wrote that." "I know," I said. Preston stepped toward the microphone. "It's not a declaration of anything," he said calmly. "It's supporting information." That sentence caught my attention. He wasn't claiming the document made Diane legally incapable. He was trying to make it sound harmless, reasonable, professional, and that made it more disturbing, because he knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to build a paper trail, a collection of photographs, statements, observations, incidents, anything that could later be presented to the right person as evidence that Diane needed someone else handling important decisions for her. Not because she was incapable, because they wanted someone to believe she was. I looked at Renee. "What did you sign?" She swallowed. "I thought it was an intake form." "For who?" "I don't know." Her voice broke. Preston said an attorney needed background information before meeting Mom. I looked at Preston. "You knew what that paperwork was being used for." He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "I gave Renee documents. She trusted me enough to sign them." "That isn't an answer." "It doesn't have to be." Renee looked at him. "You told me it was to help Mom." "And it was—" "No." Her voice became stronger. "You said it was temporary." Preston's expression hardened. "You signed it." Renee flinched. That was the moment I understood something uncomfortable. My daughter wasn't innocent. She had participated. She had helped Preston around Diane's wheelchair. She had signed paperwork without understanding what it could be used for. She had stayed quiet, but she hadn't known the whole plan. And now she was trapped between what she'd done and what Preston had turned it into. I looked back at the screen. There was another page. At the bottom was a signature block. Renee's signature was there. Below it was the name of the person who had prepared the packet. I leaned closer. I recognized the name, not because I'd ever met the person, because I'd seen it before, on an envelope Renee had left on our kitchen counter several months earlier. My heart sank. "Who is that?" Diane asked. I didn't answer. Preston saw my expression, and suddenly his smile returned. That told me the name mattered. A lot. "You remember him," Preston said. "I've never met him." "No." Preston lowered the remote. "But you know exactly who he is." Renee stared at the screen. Then she whispered, "Dad." "What?" She looked terrified. I didn't know he was involved. "Involved in what?" She shook her head. I swear, Dad, I didn't know. Preston stepped toward the microphone again. There's something else you should know. I stared at him. He smiled, not because he'd won, because he still had one card left. The paperwork wasn't created for tonight, he said. He paused. It was prepared months ago. A cold silence settled over the room. Months. That meant the wheelchair sabotage wasn't the beginning. The slideshow wasn't the beginning. The paperwork wasn't even the beginning. Whatever Preston had been planning, he'd been preparing for it long before the engagement party. I looked at my daughter. Renee, what happened months ago? She started crying, and before she could answer, Preston reached for the remote again. The screen changed. A photograph appeared. It was taken inside our house, and standing beside Diane was someone I never expected to see. I thought Preston had been manipulating my daughter for a few months. I was wrong. The photograph on that screen proved someone had been inside our home long before tonight, and that person had been helping Preston from the very beginning. He walked right into his own trap. The photograph on the screen froze the entire room. Diane was sitting at our kitchen table, and standing beside her was Martin Hale, our former financial advisor. Diane stared at the screen. Martin? I felt my stomach drop. Martin had helped us organize our retirement accounts after Diane's accident. He knew our financial situation better than almost anyone outside the family, and now his face was on a screen at my daughter's engagement party. I turned toward Renee. You knew he was involved? She shook her head. No. Her voice was barely audible. I swear, Dad. Preston stepped closer to the microphone. Martin wasn't trying to hurt Diane. Then what was he doing in my house? He was helping us understand her financial situation. I stared at him. Without her permission? Preston didn't answer. That was answer enough. I looked back at the photograph. Martin wasn't holding anything dangerous. There was nothing dramatic about the scene. Just paperwork spread across the kitchen table. But that was exactly what made it disturbing. This wasn't some wild scheme invented that night. They'd been gathering information. Property records. Financial details. Photographs. Notes about Diane's mobility. Anything that could make her appear more dependent than she really was. Not because those things automatically proved she couldn't manage her own affairs. They didn't. But because Preston wanted to build a narrative he could eventually take to professionals and say, look at all this. Isn't Diane vulnerable enough that someone else should be making these decisions? And that someone I suspected was supposed to be him. I turned toward Preston. Martin gave you access to information about us. I never said that. You didn't have to. Then I looked at Renee. Why did you save those messages? She froze. Preston turned toward her. What messages? Renee's hand went into her purse. She pulled out her phone. I started saving them weeks ago. Preston's face changed. Renee looked at me. I knew something wasn't right. Every time I asked questions, Preston got angry, so I started keeping screenshots. She opened her phone. There were messages, instructions about photographing Diane, questions about the house, messages about the wheelchair, and conversations involving Martin. Not every message proved a crime, but together they showed a pattern. A pattern Preston could no longer explain away as innocent concern. Preston stepped toward her. Give me the phone. Renee backed away. No. That one word sounded different from everything she'd said earlier. It wasn't fear. It was a decision. I should have told you sooner, Dad. I looked at her. You should have. She nodded. I know. There was no excuse, and I wasn't going to give her one. She had helped Preston. She had stayed silent. She had participated in something that could have seriously harmed her mother, but she'd also started documenting what was happening before tonight. That didn't erase what she'd done. It simply meant the story wasn't as simple as good daughter or bad daughter. She had become both accomplice and witness. I turned toward the security manager. Please preserve the camera footage from tonight. He nodded. We'll secure it. And the hotel should preserve the AV records too. The manager looked toward the technician. We'll do that. I looked at Preston. You want an audience? He said nothing. You wanted everyone here to see Diane as helpless. His jaw tightened. You wanted them to believe you were the reasonable one who needed to step in. Still nothing. But you made one mistake. Preston finally looked at me. What? You made the whole thing too complicated. I held up my phone. Too many messages. Too many photographs. Too many people involved. Then I looked at Renee. And too much evidence. Preston's confidence finally disappeared. But I didn't celebrate, because this wasn't finished. The security manager contacted law enforcement and preserved the relevant footage and records. The paperwork would have to be examined properly. Martin's involvement would have to be investigated, and if he had improperly shared information or helped create misleading material, he'd have to answer for his part in it. Nothing was going to be decided in that ballroom. That wasn't how real justice worked. The next morning, Diane and I met with an independent attorney of her choosing. Not Martin, not Preston, not anyone Renee knew. Diane chose the attorney herself. That mattered more to her than anything else. The attorney reviewed the paperwork, the photographs, and the messages. Then she looked at Diane. You have every right to make your own decisions. Diane nodded. I know. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Not because everything was fixed. It wasn't. Renee still had a lot to answer for. Martin still had questions to answer. Preston's actions would have to be investigated. But Preston had failed at the one thing he wanted most. He wanted control of the story. Instead, he had created the evidence that exposed him. As he was escorted away from the ballroom, he looked back at me. You think this is over? I shook my head. No. He frowned. I think now it's finally going to be handled the right way. He walked away. I turned toward Diane. She reached for my hand. Then Renee approached us. She stopped several feet away. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't deserve an easy one. Instead, she simply said, Mom, I'm sorry. Diane looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly, I'm not ready to trust you yet. Renee nodded. I understand. And that was enough. Because some wounds don't disappear because someone says sorry. Some trust has to be rebuilt one day at a time. I looked back at the empty platform. The folding chair was still sitting there. The same chair Preston had checked all night. The same chair he believed would be part of his perfect little performance. I never touched it. I never sabotaged it. I never needed to. Preston had built the trap himself. All I did was refuse to step into it with him. And when he finally walked into the consequences of his own plan, there was nothing I had to push. He walked right into it himself. And that, I learned, is sometimes the coldest revenge of all.